We're picking up right where we left off in our last episode with the disastrous St. Lawrence campaign. This time, we're following Major General James Wilkinson's ill-fated journey along the river, culminating in the pivotal Battle of Chrysler's Farm. We'll also witness the shocking aftermath in the Niagara region as the burning of Newark sparks a brutal cycle of retaliation. Get ready for a raw look at the harsh realities of war, the devastation it brought to communities, and the resilience of those who endured. We'll also delve into the daily lives of soldiers on both sides, giving you a glimpse into the struggles and sacrifices they faced during this tumultuous period. So buckle up for a gripping episode filled with twists, turns, and the often overlooked human stories of the War of 1812. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. Our last episode ended, admittedly, with a bit of a cliffhanger. Let's recap the last little bit of that episode. The Americans were embarking on what was known as the St. Lawrence campaign. The goal was to capture Montreal, eventually. The thought was that they would be able to cut off the rest of Upper Canada if they controlled Montreal and the St. Lawrence River. And this plan was drawn up by U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr. There were two columns for the Americans descending on Montreal. One was headed up by Major General Wade Hampton. With 4,000 men under his command, he was going from Plattsburgh, north on Lake Champlain, to attack Montreal. Along the way, he would end up meeting with Major General James Wilkinson and his force of 8,000 men, who were traveling to Montreal along the St. Lawrence River, having set out from Sackett's Harbor. While the plan was good in theory, it was an absolute mess. Wilkinson had a bad reputation, and Hampton wanted nothing to do with him. Neither column had anywhere near enough in the way of supplies, and they were dealing with illness running through the ranks. The officers were nowhere near experienced enough, and all the troops lacked training. Hampton had set up on the Chateauguay River, where he was forced to wait for Wilkinson to begin his movement towards Montreal. Then Armstrong, who was in charge of the operation, decided to hand things over to Wilkinson and return to Washington, D.C. from Sackett's Harbor, and he sent a note to Hampton advising him of this, and he was on his way. The letter got into Hampton's hands the day before the Battle of Chateauguay, where the Americans were soundly defeated. Hampton would send off his resignation and fell back to Four Corners after the defeat. While this was happening, the force under the command of Wilkinson left Sackett's Harbor on October 17th. They would reach Grenadier Island at the head of the St. Lawrence before reorganizing and then setting off for French Creek. From French Creek, the force of 8,000 men on around 300 boats continued up the St. Lawrence and then arrived at the town of Hogues. There, on November 6th, Wilkinson learned of the defeat of Hampton at Chateauguay 11 days earlier. The American column moved up along the river, and it was seen by Lieutenant Duncan Clark of the British forces. Under orders to raise the alarm if the Americans were spotted, he would commandeer a plow horse and rode it along the path to Prescott, calling out that the Americans were coming. His cry, "The enemy is at hand," and the length of his journey was likened by some to the ride of Paul Revere in 1775 at the outset of the American Revolution. Unlike Paul Revere's ride, however, Clark did it himself, not with 40 others who had the task to raise the alarm. Wilkinson would get past Prescott on November 7th using the cover of night and a little ingenuity. The men disembarked and they went on land around Ogdensburg on the south shore of the river before getting back on the boats on the other side. The British and militia had set up defenses at Point Iroquois near modern-day Matilda. There they saw the Americans under the command of General Alexander Macomb land the next day, and they were able to open fire. However, the Americans outmanned and outgunned the opposition in short order, forcing them to retreat and allowing them to continue on their way. Another skirmish would take place that night nearby at Doran's Farm, as a detachment of American dragoons would encounter militia from the nearby counties of Dundas and Glengarry. The Americans would continue and then set up camp near Cook's Tavern on November 10th. The movements by the Americans were of no real surprise to the British. They knew what was happening, and the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Francis de Rottenberg, would assemble men at Kingston, waiting to see where the men who had left Sackett's Harbor had gone. Once he had word they were moving downriver along the St. Lawrence, he sent forward what he called a Corps of Observation. This was a detachment of 650 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison. They would travel along the river to Prescott, where they would join up with another 240 men. The British were pursuing an American force of 8,000, with 900. The forces under Morrison's command would set up at Chrysler's Farm, 2 miles upstream from where the Americans were. The area between the two sides suited the British tactics. It was open, and the weather had made the region around the farm a quagmire, and even the woods were more like a marsh. The morning of November 11th, a force of gunboats on the St. Lawrence under the command of Commander William Mulcaster opened fire on the American boats that were gathering at Cook's Point. This commotion prompted the Americans to turn and seek an engagement with the smaller British force. Canadian dragoons would race to the British camp, interrupting breakfast to warn that the Americans were on the way. The British soldiers formed up their lines, ready to fire deadly volleys into any oncoming force. Around 10:30 in the morning, Wilkinson received word from his scouts the path to Cornwall was clear. All he would have to do was deal with the pesky Corps of Observation that was following him. Wilkinson delegated command of the engagement to Brigadier General John Parker Boyd, his third in command, as he was ill, and the second in command, Major General Morgan Lewis, was indisposed. Indisposed, an old military term for either being too drunk or too hungover for duty. The British formed a skirmish line in a ravine to the left of the American position with 3 companies of the Canadian Voltigare under the command of Major General Frederick Harriot. 24 Mohawk soldiers from Tonawanda were also there with him. On the right of the main British line was 150 men from the 49th Regiment of Foot and the Canadian Fencibles, along with the 6-pounder gun. There were 3 more companies from the 89th Regiment of Foot behind them, and then the main body of the British forces, 460 men with 2 more 6-pounders on a small hill that could fire over the heads of the 49th. The Americans waited until the afternoon, then advanced on the British set up at Chrysler's Farm. The skirmish line would be pushed back towards the woods when the 89th Regiment, who had concealed themselves before the battle started, popped up and unleashed volleys on the advancing Americans. This would force the advance to halt as the Americans fell back. Another American brigade advanced towards the 49th, who they mistook for Canadian militia. Why did they make that mistake? Well, instead of their traditional red tunics, they were in gray jackets, similar to what the Canadian militia wore due to the weather. The British took advantage of this, with the Americans thinking they were fighting an inferior force. The regulars opened fire, and this opening volley would claim the life of the commanding officer of the brigade and the second in command. Then the Americans brought up their artillery. Lieutenant Colonel John Harvey ordered the 49th to advance and capture those guns. They would have a hellacious time doing it, with fences and artillery fire holding them up, and they got charged 3 times by American dragoons during the advance, but they kept going. The Americans saw that this advance of the 49th was inevitable, so they opted to withdraw their artillery, but one of the cannon would get bogged down in the mud. The British kept up the advance, and the onslaught eventually proving too much for the Americans, who broke ranks and ran. Rushing to their boats, they would cross the St. Lawrence back over to the American side as the weather started to turn for the worse and darkness fell. The British had won the day. The Americans would see 102 men fall during the battle and another 237 wounded. There were also 120 men who were captured. On November 12th, the day after the battle, Wilkinson received a reply from Hampton regarding the orders to meet up at Cornwall before continuing on towards Montreal. The reply Hampton didn't have the supplies to continue, and he had already returned to Plattsburgh. Wilkinson called a council of war, and it was decided the advance on Montreal would be called off. Eventually, Wilkinson would have to return to Plattsburgh himself due to a lack of supplies. The site of the Battle of Chrysler's Farm is today underwater. It was submerged during the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway when they built the Moses Saunders Power Dam. Now, while all of this was happening along the St. Lawrence, there were major events unfolding in the Niagara Peninsula. Now, we're going to jump back in time a little bit. De Rottenberg had issued an order on October 9th for all of the men in the Niagara Peninsula to gather at Burlington Heights, where they would then march on to Kingston. He was all but surrendering that part of Upper Canada to the Americans. This decision would see him be relieved of command in the first week of December of 1813 and replaced by Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond. Drummond was a little more aggressive than his predecessor and canceled the order to retreat. Instead, he began to organize the forces at Burlington Heights for an offensive. The goal would be to push the Americans back across the Niagara River and perhaps go on from there. The Americans controlled a fair amount of territory on the Canadian side. They held Queenston and Chippewa, as well as Newark and Fort George. However, they only had 200 men in the region. With this in mind, Brigadier General George McClure decided to fall back to Fort Niagara on the other side of the river from Fort George, knowing that the Americans would have to deal with the British who were making an advance. Now, this decision triggered an order from the American Secretary of War. This order was to set the town of Newark to the torch. The people were to be given several days' notice so they could have time to collect their belongings and safely get out, but the town was to be razed. Only part of that order was followed. The Americans gave the people of Newark 2 hours' notice, and then the town was burnt to the ground. The cause of the short notice was really the result of the anger of one man, a Canadian sympathizer who had led a unit of Canadian volunteers who fought for the Americans, named Joseph Wilcox. He was determined to punish his former neighbors for every slight, real or imagined. His men went door to door, telling everyone to get out, and the destruction began as night fell. Amelia Ryers was 16 at the time and recalled what happened. When I looked up, I saw the hillside and the fields as far as the eye could reach covered with American soldiers. My mother knew instinctively what they were going to do. She entreated the commanding officer to spare her property and said she was a widow with a young family. He answered her very civilly and respectfully and regretted that his orders were to burn. Very soon we saw a column of dark smoke rise from every building. In what at early morn had been a prosperous homestead, at noon there were only smoldering ruins. In the home of William Dickinson, Wilcox set the fire himself and left Mrs. Dixon, who was ill, wrapped in blankets on the snow watching her home burn. There were 400 refugees now who needed shelter in the middle of the winter. Captain William Hamilton Merritt commanded a force of dragoons and saw the glow of the fire to the east of his position. He and his men raced to the scene and were greeted by utter destruction. All that remained of the American forces was the rear guard, who happened to be the Canadian Volunteers under Wilcox's command. A charge was ordered and the volunteers were routed. Every building in Newark was a pile of embers. People were doing anything they could for shelter. Lean-tos were built against the old chimneys that were left untouched after the rest of the home had burned to the ground. Some went to Fort George to find shelter there. Lieutenant Colonel John Harvey wrote, "As to the burning of the town of Niagara, in which a number of old and infirm persons were left to perish in the snow, an act which, the season of the year and all the other circumstances considered, is unexampled in barbarity." It is not known how many casualties there were from the burning of Newark, but it was something that the British would remember. The thought of vengeance would be on the mind for all of the British and Canadian forces. For his role in the burning of Newark, McClure would find himself relieved of command and being dismissed from the army. The incident also raised a furor in England. There it was reported civilians froze to death while the town burned around them, and across the Atlantic there was a call for vengeance. The British would retake Fort George after it had been abandoned, and they set their sights on Fort Niagara, on the American side of the river, where things were not ideal, to say the least. Captain Nathaniel Leonard was the man in charge of the fort. He was an alcoholic, and under his command the fort had fallen into disrepair. intermittent shelling during the opening months of the war from Fort George across the river had caused damage that was never fixed. The morale of the men was also low. It was a prime target for the British, and Drummond was keen to go on the offensive. Now, let us take a quick look at who Drummond was. Born in Quebec City in 1772, he was an officer in the British Army and the first Canadian-born man to lead the military and civil government of Upper Canada. He received his education in England at Westminster School and entered the Army as an ensign with the 1st Regiment of Foot in 1789. He served as a junior lieutenant colonel at the Siege of Nijmegen. It led the 8th Regiment of Foot at the Battle of Chateauguay in Egypt. He also fought in the Battle of Alexandria and the capture of Cairo. In 1809, he found himself back in Canada on the staff of Sir James Henry Craig. He would be reassigned to Ulster in 1811, before coming back to North America to replace de Rottenburg in 1813. Drummond ordered Colonel John Murray to cross the river and take Fort Niagara. On December 18th, Murray set out with his men. There were 500 under his command, coming from the Grenadiers of the 1st Royal Scots, the 41st Regiment of Foot, the 100th Regiment of Foot, and the 41st Light Company, plus many militiamen. The crossing took place around 5 kilometers upstream from the fort, and the men, once across, moved silently through the night. At Youngstown, they captured the pickets and learned the challenge pass for the day. Once they got to the fort, Sergeant Andrew Spearman of the 100th Regiment would use an American accent to try to fool the guards into opening the gates. It worked, and the door opened only for the guard to have this sergeant's massive hands wrapped around his throat. The rest of the gates swung open and the British rushed in. The taking of the fort would be by bayonet, with only one volley fired, and that from the Royal Scots. The cries from the wounded pierced through the night. Some of the Americans locked themselves inside the southern redoubt of the fort. Murray urged them to surrender, but they refused. The officer offered no quarter, and once the door was broken, they would all find death at the end of the bayonet. Leonard, unsurprisingly, was indisposed at the time of the capture of the fort, in his home 2 miles away. He would be captured by the British, the stench of alcohol ripe on his breath. Just 6 of the British men were killed and another 5 wounded. Of the Americans, 65 were killed, 14 wounded, and 344 men taken prisoner. The initial force soon received reinforcements, with Major General Phineas Riall bringing more from the Royal Scots and the 41st Regiment across the river. The order was given by Riall to torch Youngstown and Tuscarora. They continued their march, burning every building they came across. Other towns would be put to the torch: Lewiston, Manchester, Fort Schlosser. The advance would finally come to a stop when Wilcox's Canadian Volunteers burned the bridge over the Tonawanda Creek, and Riall returned to the Canadian side of the Niagara. The decision was made to cross back over, this time upstream from Niagara Falls. The boats moved overland, and 1,400 men under the command of Riall would cross back over the night of December 29th. The orders from Drummond were simple: capture any supplies that could be moved and destroy the rest. This included any American ships at Buffalo or Black Rock. Any buildings that could be used to shelter American soldiers were to be burned. But there was one strict rule: no looting. Any British soldier caught looting was to be put to death as punishment. Most of the men landed around 2 miles downstream of Black Rock. The men of the Royal Scots, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Gordon, were directed to land at Black Rock itself. The Americans found out that the British had crossed the river when the Light Infantry Company of the 89th Regiment took the bridge over the Tonawanda Creek and captured the artillery battery there. A reconnaissance force was sent up to find out the situation. When they were fired on by the British, they retreated. The American officer in charge, Major General Amos Hall, sent a second force. They too were sent packing at the first volley of fire. Then, Hall took command of the reconnaissance force himself. When the Royal Scots tried to land at Black Rock, they were met by what was described as a very heavy fire of cannon and musketry. The Scots would suffer substantial casualties before they could get ashore. While all this was happening, Riall took the main body of his column and attacked, with his left wing attacking the right flank of the Americans. After around 30 minutes, the right flank of the Americans broke, and to avoid being outflanked, Hall ordered a general retreat. The British pursued the fleeing Americans, who went to Buffalo. There, the British would sack the city and burned it to the ground. By the time this was done, there were just 4 buildings left standing. The town, which had a population of 1,500 before the war, was devastated. There was a big difference between the burning of Buffalo, though, and the burning of Newark. While this action was taken as a measure of revenge for the burning of Newark, the people of the area were actually given quite a bit of time to leave, and the same for Black Rock, which was also leveled by the British. There was only one civilian casualty reported, and that was in Buffalo, a woman who was killed in an altercation with an Indigenous soldier. The British assault on Buffalo and Black Rock would see 50 American soldiers killed and 52 wounded. Another 67 were captured. The British had 25 regulars killed and 3 militiamen, along with 3 Indigenous irregulars. Another 72 men were wounded, and 9 men were missing. The majority of those killed and missing were from the Royal Scots during the landing at Black Rock. Now, at this point, I just want to point out why I include the casualties of the battles that we cover. Throughout history, there have been wars, and there have been casualties. The further we look back at these wars, the more removed we are from them, and often romanticize the actual human toll that these battles took. I present the numbers not to numb people about the grim reality of war, but to let them know that there were casualties. Yes, we here in Canada consider the War of 1812 as a great patriotic adventure, but literally thousands of men died during the fighting, and thousands more were wounded. And when we are talking about engagements here, where there were maybe 300 men combined, to read or hear that there were easily 5% of those who took part killed and another 10 to 15% wounded, this is significant. These were people who would have their lives, and the lives of the people closest to them, changed in an instant during combat, no matter whether we agree with the reason for the combat or not. Back to the War of 1812. After the Battle of Buffalo, as it came to be called, the Commander-in-Chief for the British forces in North America, Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, issued an official proclamation expressing his regret that the miseries inflicted upon the inhabitants of Newark had necessitated such retaliation. During the War of 1812, it was expected that the militaries would go to what is called winter quarters during the, winter. This meant an end to the big campaigns and offensives, and leaders would start drawing up strategies, maneuvering men around, and so forth. The plans would be drawn up for when the weather would be more cooperative for military action. This was also due in part to the conditions and the equipment they had. It wasn't like you find today where the military has top-of-the-line equipment that handles the conditions. Soldiers would often find themselves with just an extra greatcoat and struggling with the cold. A unit that was poorly supplied or poorly equipped will be even in worse shape. Now, let's take a look at the life of a soldier in 1813 and 14 in the British Army. Starting with the officers, their level of comfort really commiserated with their financial situation. Officers purchased their ranks for the most part. They were required to pay for their own equipment, their own uniforms, clothing, and such. The better off an officer was, the better off he would be. For the enlisted men, it was a very different story. Yes, their uniform was paid by the military and issued to them as it became worn out. At least they were supposed to be issued new equipment when the old stuff wore out. The average private was paid $1 a day for their service. This works out to roughly the equivalent of $8 Canadian or about $12 American, give or take a bit. The diet was very different as well. The food consisted of roughly 1.5 pounds of bread, 1 pound of beef, fresh if available, but usually salted, and around 1/4 cup of rum. Now back to the actual battle or combat for a bit. This war would see the start of the use of rifles on a regular basis, even if they were still slow to reload. Muskets, though, were still the standard. A soldier could fire and reload his musket 3 times in a minute if he were really, really good, and the goal was to maintain a rolling volley through the lines. The front line would fire, take a knee, while the line behind them fired, then they would drop to a knee, and then the line behind them would fire, and it would repeat like this as needed. The sound would be deafening, and the smoke from the muskets would create a fog of war that would hang thick and acrid over the field. The lines would advance, sometimes close. When they were close enough for hand-to-hand combat, things would truly get brutal. Bayonets would be used up to 40 centimeters or 8 inches long, and they were more like a sword. Attached to the end of a musket, it resembled a pike. During the hand-to-hand fighting, sometimes a bayonet would get stuck in the body of an enemy. It could get pulled off, with the musket now more reliable as a club than a firearm. Biting, clawing, scratching, eye gouging all happened when the two lines would close. Then there was the cacophony of the dead and dying. The screams of men who are wounded could be heard at levels well above the sounds of the battle itself. The smell of men who had lost control of their bodies. The smell of death lingering over everything, on top of the smell of gunpowder. Those who were able to get medical treatment wouldn't get anything close to what we would today. Amputation was used liberally, as it was easier to remove a limb shattered by a bullet than to try to heal it. There was the constant risk of infection of the wounded, and there were no antibiotics. It would be a thought and a prayer that someone with an infection could fight it off and live to see another day. So, we went off track just a little bit there, but that's not a bad thing. The point I was getting to was that after the Battle of Buffalo, the armies were in winter quarters for the next little bit, drawing up the plans for the offensives that would happen. While there was no fighting between the British and the Americans, the U.S. would still find themselves fighting battles. The Creek War was continuing in the southern states. Now, this war was part of the War of 1812, but it wasn't at the same time. It was initially a war between opposing Creek factions, with the British, Americans, Spanish, and Tecumseh Confederacy all getting involved at some point. Andrew Jackson led the American forces, and they sided with the lower Creeks, the Cherokee and the Choctaw, while the Red Stick Creeks were supported by the British, Spanish, and Tecumseh. These battles would continue in the southern United States, where the snow and freezing temperatures that necessitated winter quarters weren't as prevalent. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we will see what happens as the armies come out of winter quarters and the battles resume around Lake Ontario. As well, the British will see a boost to their forces as the Napoleonic Wars end, for now. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.